Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're going to cover Chapter 9, Health and Medicine. Let's go and get started. Now, before I get started, just want to let you know that there might be some differences between what's in the lecture and what's in the textbook. Like I said before, I've used a couple of social problems books. I've kind of pulled things from different books, but for the most part, everything that you'll need will be in the lecture as far as testing purposes, right? So when I give you the study guide, and it'll pretty much be based off of this. Okay, so just to let you know, just in case you read the textbook and there's something in here that isn't in the text. Okay, so first thing we're going to cover is kind of some definitional stuff, right? Essentially, what is health, right? And the way we're going to measure health. So health is the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. All right, that may sound a little vague, but the idea is that it's meant to be, right? The idea is that, what is your physical health, right? What is your mental health? What is your social well-being? Like, how do we measure that? How do we determine what that is? And there's quite a few different ways to do that, right? And there's quite a few different ways to measure our own physical, mental, and social well-being. And then we can start kind of going, large scale, right? So you can look at micro, how I'm feeling physically, mentally, as far as my well-being, socially, or we can look at kind of macro, right? Larger scale, right? As a community, physical well-being, mental well-being, social well-being, as far as a community, and really as a society, right? We can definitely look at both, and both are important to look at. This is a sociology course, right? So we're going to focus on both of those, right? And one way that we do focus on those, and could be a little difficult to discuss, right? But we'll look at infant mortality rate, right? So that would be a measure or a way to measure essentially the physical health, right? Or how well a particular country or society is doing in terms of providing health or health care to its population, right? So infant mortality rate, which is essentially the number of babies who essentially, unfortunately, pass away after their, within their first year of life, right? So this is the way we measure. So in countries with low infant mortality rates, we'll argue that these countries provide better than standard or we can say exceptional healthcare, right? When we have very low infant mortality rate. In countries that do not, or countries that have a high mortality rate or infant mortality rate, we can argue don't do well in terms of providing adequate healthcare, right? Life expectancy at birth, chronic disease, we can keep going, right? There's quite a few different ways that we measure this, all right? Here in the United States, we could argue in other industrialized or westernized countries, right? Or we consider first world countries. Aging is a big one, even though I didn't put it on here. Aging populations could be an indicator, right, of how well a country does in terms of providing complete physical, mental, and social well-being. I mean, we're vastly approaching, we're practically there already in terms of the baby boomers, right? We're essentially going to witness one of the largest populations of elderly that we've ever had, right? And we can argue that this is the result of having adequate mental, physical, and social well-being, right? We provide healthcare to our population, and this healthcare has allowed individuals to live longer, right? So we've increased our life expectancy, right? So some people argue this is a good thing, and some people argue this is maybe a bad thing, right? Because if we have a increasingly larger elderly population that's using resources, right, that aren't being replenished, who replenishes those resources? The argument you can say is that people of working age, right? So people that are younger will provide the money or the resources, right? And they'll feed into Social Security and these other social welfare programs that these baby boomers will be using, right? So if we don't have enough individuals putting into the system that these older individuals are taking away from, right, there could be a problem, right? And I'm sure you guys have seen this, right, on the news here in the United States, but other countries as well, right? I think Japan and other countries are kind of trying to encourage people to have children. Maybe when historically maybe they weren't encouraging people, and maybe discouraging people to not have children, right? And get countries where they have quotas and things like that for, or requirements for number of babies that can be born to particular couple. So we can get into all that, right? But just something to think about. All right, so let's kind of focus on, of course, right, the different views, right? So for conservatives, conservatives are going to argue that, this is a capitalist system. I mean, not to say Democrats won't either, right? Because it is a capitalist system, but the idea is that healthcare should be, it's a free market, right? In terms of healthcare. So the individuals who have money for healthcare, well, they can pay for it, right? And any attempt by the government, right, to control healthcare, would not be welcomed, right? Would it be seen as maybe government overreach or overstep, right? We don't want the government getting involved in our healthcare. We can go ahead and take care of that ourselves, right? If I want healthcare, if I can afford healthcare, then I'll pay for it, right? I don't want the government telling me what to do in terms of my healthcare, right? And we saw this, right, with Obamacare, and some people still have issues with Obamacare, or we consider it to be not Obamacare, but universal healthcare, right? This idea that if you don't have it, then you may be penalized in your taxes and things like that, right? But we'll get into universal healthcare or Obamacare in a little bit. But essentially, the idea is a choice allows people to select doctors and insurance, right? That's kind of the idea. We want to minimize government interference in these things, right? So they do not support Affordable Care Acts or the Affordable Care Act. They're going to argue the competition improves the quality and value for consumers, right? So the idea is that this competition drives innovation, right? That if we're in a free market, when people compete, right, the idea is that the consumer wins out, right? Because you got these competing companies that are trying to, make money, right? So they make money, and they essentially what they do is they battle it out with other, competing healthcare, companies, right? So who's going to provide the best deal for the best price is that, and their belief is that that's going to go ahead and provide the best quality of service, but also possibly the best price for that service, right? So competition is good, is what the argument would be, right? Competition leads to innovation and improvements, right, in the healthcare industry. We can argue for that, right? And I can go and argue against it, but for the conservatives, that's what they'll argue, right? Individual responsibility for one's own health, right? So once again, this goes back to this idea of you as an individual have responsibility to provide healthcare service for yourself, and it's really nobody else's responsibility, right? If you're a properly socialized, productive member of society, then this is something that you should be able to provide for yourself, and that you shouldn't rely on the government or other institutions to provide this for you, right? It is kind of the idea. So, in line, with everything else we've talked about, right? And then we have the left, right? So essentially liberals, combination of healthcare for profit with access for all, right? So the idea is that we can go ahead and profit from a healthcare, but there should be systems in place, or healthcare in place that provides these services to individuals who aren't financially able to provide it for themselves, right? So they would support the Affordable Care Act, right? And they would also definitely support larger involvement from the government. Essentially, they argue the government, or this is or one of the responsibilities of the government, right, is to provide healthcare, right? And we do have that here in the United States, right? We have Medicaid, Medi-Cal, we have universal. So we have these things, right? But some people will argue that they're not provided at the level or that they should be, right? And we can kind of get into that, right? Obviously, I'm sure you guys have all heard, the back and forth, right, between other Western countries or other, first world countries as far as their healthcare service, like Canada and Great Britain, right? And we won't go into all of them, but we can, use them as examples a little bit later. And then the idea of costs, right? Costs would be offset by having a healthier, more productive population. So the idea is that if you provide healthcare for individuals, that we benefit in multiple different ways, right? We have obviously the physical health of individuals, right? Benefits. We have healthier physical outcomes, and we have healthier individuals as far as like mental health. And we talk a little bit about mental health too, because there's a whole stigma that's connected with that as well. That's an issue. And then there's like social well-being, right? So the idea is that a healthy population is a productive population, right? And that a productive population does in fact, work more, they're happier at work, right? So the less stress, those kind of things, right? So the idea is that by the government getting involved in healthcare in this way, that what it does is it creates a system that's more productive, right? If you want to look at it that way, right? That the government provides these things for us, and we're a healthier, happier population, okay? And then we have, of course, right, radicals, right? And radicals are just going to argue that to improve healthcare, that we must essentially, remove the profit from healthcare and replace capitalism with socialism, right? Um, we can get into that as well, right? But we'll just stick with the liberal and conservative views of healthcare for now, right? Um, Not to get to complicate things too much, right? All right, so let's kind of go over some basic things for this chapter, right? As far as ideas or concepts, right? So the idea of high income nations and low income nations, right? And I've already talked about this, right? As far as like first world countries or Western countries, right? In terms of the access they have resources to, as far as like healthcare, right? So what is a high income nation, right? Rich nations like North America, Western Europe, Japan would be considered these countries, right? Their population does have access to these resources, being healthcare, right? And they do have a very high standard of living, high life expectancies, low infant mortality rates. Even though the United States, for as much as we have, has this actually pretty high mortality rate, based on the resources we have access to. Okay, so those would be your high income nations. Okay. This is just a kind of quick image, right, as far as infant mortality rates and as far as like a global perspective, right? So you can see here on the map that Canada, very low, fewer than 5%. Then you have the United States, creeping in at 15 or 5 to 15, so low. And then we have average like Brazil, Peru, Algeria, things like places like this. And then you can kind of see how it kind of shifts from there, right? In terms of countries and the infant mortality rates. Right, low-income nations, kind of what we've kind of looked at on that map, right, would suffer from a lot of these issues, right? So poor mental health, poor physical health, poor social well-being, right? So in low-income nations, you're looking at about a billion people suffer from serious illness due to poverty. So this idea is going back to like the chapter on stratification, right, when we talked about absolute poverty and relative poverty, right? So low-income nations would be definitely absolute poverty. So these countries or the individuals who live in this country would definitely fall under absolute poverty, because essentially what would happen is they're lacking important resources, right? And those resources would be access to shelter, access to food, access to water, access to education, access to healthcare services, right? So if you're lacking access to any one of these things, then your life is in danger, right? So malnutrition, definitely one of them. Drinking water, poor sanitation is the idea, right? So these countries are living in absolute poverty. Just not having access to one of those things would definitely put your life in jeopardy. And then we have this idea of acute diseases, right? Illnesses that strike suddenly. Well, up until recently, right? Not to say that this isn't something that first world countries don't or they're not concerned with, because they definitely are concerned with, right? But the argument is that we would have better systems in place to kind of help deal with these acute diseases, right? So the illnesses that strike someone would be Ebola, malaria, cholera, typhoid, measles, diarrhea. That's kind of the idea. We do have these, right? Every so often, right? We'll have a little outbreak. Maybe there'll be a mosquito that makes its way up here, and we'll have some kind of acute disease that we kind of deal with, but for a brief, short period of time, right? These aren't diseases that we're worried about, right? And not to say that we don't have reason to worry about them, but kind of don't. I mean, none of us here, I would argue, are worried about catching Ebola or catching malaria or cholera or typhoid, right? These aren't diseases that we worry about. And the reason why is because, well, we live in the country, right, where we can essentially provide medical care to prevent these things from, essentially prevent an outbreak is really what it is, right? And when we do have an outbreak like that, we kind of quickly clamp it down. So social epidemiology, right? How health and disease are distributed throughout a society's population. So, we just recently dealt with what would be an endemic, pandemic, right? It's shifted, right? So it was a pandemic, would you consider epidemic, and now it's an endemic. So like with COVID, right, is what I'm referring to. So COVID isn't going anywhere, right? At this point now, we can argue this is going to be endemic, right? That spreads rapidly throughout population for sure, right? But uh, it's not leaving, right? It's not a situation where, um, by next year we won't have to deal with COVID. So it's here. It's going to be with us for a long time, if not indefinitely, right? So this is kind of the idea. The example they use in the textbook would be HIV, right? Which I think people don't talk about, right? I'm not sure. I could be wrong, but doesn't it feel like this isn't something we discuss anymore, right? HIV or AIDS hasn't gone anywhere. It's definitely still, a serious disease, and I don't think people talking about HIV in the way that they should. Depending on your age, right? You might have remember growing up and hearing about HIV or AIDS, right? And it was something that was very serious. Not to say it's not serious now, but I feel like maybe it's kind of lost its maybe I don't say the fear behind it, right? But maybe the urgency or the importance, right, of being protected, protecting yourself, and every so often, right, we'll hear about particularly different types of STDs, right, that'll spring up, right, when people essentially stop kind of protecting themselves. I remember not too long ago there was outbreak. There was for a while, right? There was an outbreak of syphilis, which wasn't something we dealt with here in the United States in quite a long time, right? But there's people getting infected with syphilis. So, those things do exist, but thankfully, we have, we have the ability to kind of quickly respond to those outbreaks. And like I said, prevent them from spreading in a way that affects the majority of the population, or a large percent of the population, right? So, like I said, continuing with the whole idea of AIDS, because this is what was used in the textbook, right? So the AIDS epidemic has already wiped out about 20 million people in Africa, dramatically dropping life expectancy in much of Central and Southern Africa to about 50 years. Okay. So here in the United States, it's still a problem. It definitely is. And I'm not trying to say in any way, shape, or form that it isn't something that we're not still concerned with. I just think that maybe for a lot of us, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. Like, I don't think there hasn't been a big push, to remind people that this is something they should still be very worried or concerned with, right? So here in the United States, we're looking at about 3% of HIV cases, and that's looking, now this might be a little bit old, but I was anywhere from about 600 to 700,000 people. It's probably closer to 700, maybe 750,000 people now, give or take, have died from AIDS, right? Since it started in the 1980s. So 700,000 people since the 1980s, as opposed to 20 million people in Africa. So that is quite a difference in as far as numbers, right? So this can be attributed to essentially what, right? The resources that we have access to. The resources we have access to here has definitely saved lives, millions of lives, right? So in low-income nations, not having these resources is essentially, for a lot of people, a death sentence, right? You just don't have the money to fight these things. And there's other things other than AIDS too, right? There's other diseases, Ebola, malaria, things like that too, right? That can be treated, if they were here, but in these other countries, you're not going to get those treatments, right? And there's a lot of other things too, not just diseases, parasites, worms, things like that. We just don't worry about that stuff here. For those of you who are not familiar, guinea worm but still is a huge problem. Guinea worm is a parasite that lays its larva on the top of water. When people ingest the water, the worm matures and grows inside the person. And then when it matures, the worm, it comes out, it leaves the body, and it can leave the body in any, it can exit the body in any part, but usually it kind of does it in the extremities. So you got like a 2 or 3 foot worm literally making its way out of your skin, right? And there's video of this, you guys can go watch it, of people with like a little pencil or little rod, right? Just kind of twirling it and pulling out this worm and massaging the leg of the infected a person to kind of get this worm to come out. And the leg is swollen. I can imagine it's incredibly painful, and not just painful, but psychologically, right? I mean, could you imagine having somebody massage a 3-foot worm out of your body? What that does to you, right? I mean, that's just not something that we worry about here, right? When other parts of the world, that's a concern, like a daily concern, right? Where am I going to get safe drinking water? All right, so now let's kind of getting into the medical systems, right? So socialized medicine, a medical care system which the government owns and operates most medical facilities, employs most physicians. So one example, and there's other examples, right? Would be Great Britain. Socialized system of healthcare since 1948, and a market-based system, right? So you can you have access to healthcare that's provided by the government, and if you so choose, right, you can actually purchase healthcare if you like, also if you have the money to do so. But the idea is that everybody's covered, right? National Health Service is funded by tax dollars and covers all British citizens, right? So we have universal healthcare here, right? But the idea is that there's still a lot left to be desired, right, in terms of the types of programs that we have here. And then private healthcare for those who can pay, right? So maybe not a bad system, right? If you're a British citizen, you're guaranteed medical care, right? Just by being a citizen. Perfect. And if you have the money to purchase, specialized care, then you can go ahead and do that, right? If you so choose. So not a bad system. Some people will knock it and argue that it's horrible, but I've never experienced it, right? Unfortunately, it would be kind of nice. Maybe some of you have, if you from other countries and you've experienced something like that, share that with us. But it doesn't seem like a bad idea, right? All right. So why the current focus on healthcare? And this is an old chapter for me. A lot of the information here is a little dated, which I apologize for, but it's funny, as dated as it may be, it's still current in the sense that we're still dealing with the same things, right? This isn't something that goes away. Healthcare is constantly a topic of conversation or an issue, right, for us in this country. It's not going away. Actually, I think it's getting worse, right? I think for us now as a social problem or as a social issue, healthcare is a major problem. I mean, if you think about GoFundMe, right? I think the vast majority of GoFundMe pages are for healthcare costs, right? People that are incurred some kind of healthcare costs that they need help paying for, right? So think about that, right? Why are people relying on GoFundMe pages, right, to help pay for their medical? It's a problem, right? When you think about how much medicine costs, how much it costs to go to the doctor, and then you can even ask yourself, like this isn't an in-person class, right? As well as you guys could raise your hand, maybe, but think about it. You just ask yourselves, when's the last time you went to the doctor, right? For a checkup, some preventative health care, right? And for those of you who have gone recently, awesome. And for those of us who haven't, why not? Is it because we're lazy? We just don't want to go? Is it because, well, we're afraid of how much it's going to cost? I mean, think about people that don't have health care, right? Think about when they have an injury or something that goes wrong, they kind of just go without health care, or maybe something even worse or scarier, right? The idea is like, well, maybe something hurts, problems eating, upset stomach. Oh, it's just this, it's just that, right? When it turns out to be something more serious, right? If you would have gone sooner to see a doctor, you might have been able to catch something, that before it turned into something more, right? Not to go into any more, make it horrible detail, right? But just the idea that preventative healthcare is essentially that, right? You go in, you see a doctor, you go for a checkup, and they make sure you're doing okay before anything happens that will be more difficult to fix. It's just the whole idea of too, right? Like you get a toothache, right? And you let it go and you let it go until you're in so much pain that you can't eat anymore, right? And it could have been just a cavity that needed to be filled, right? Or something along those lines. And that cavity turned into something else, a root canal, or maybe the infection traveled into the bone and, or something else, or the infection traveled into your bloodstream. So now you're in the hospital and now it's a mess. Now you're essentially could be dying because all you needed to do was just go to the dentist and get a filling, right? But we postpone or put off seeing the doctor because, well, for a lot of us, right, we just don't have the money for it. Okay, so the United States ranks lower than most high income countries in health of the population. So we should be doing a better job, right, is the argument. The United States spends more per person for healthcare than any other country. But just because we're spending more money doesn't mean we're getting more services, we're getting more healthcare, right? Health in the United States reflects economic inequality. So the idea is that individuals who have the means of resources enjoy having access to healthcare, and those who don't have means of resources do not have access to healthcare, right? And those would be the individuals that would put off seeing a doctor because they can't afford it, and then it eventually turns into something that could be fatal, right? Is the idea. And now we have this idea of the direct free system, right? Medical care system in which patients or their insurers pay directly for the services of physicians and hospitals. So a lot of you here at Sinai College may actually want to go into nursing or go into the medical field, right? So you might be familiar with a lot of these terms already, right? And maybe even working in the medical field, right, where you see a lot of this, right, happen, where people choose what kind of medical procedures to undergo, what kind of medical testing they can afford, right? You understand that, medical care isn't based on, essentially it's based on what you can afford, right? And if you can't afford it, then you're in trouble, right? So health costs were about 2.8 trillion in 2012. Like I said, these are a little dated, so I'm going to argue it's probably more now, but just think about that, $2.8 trillion as of 2012. And there's 6 reasons behind the soaring cost of healthcare. One would be the spread of private insurance. So private insurance companies are essentially in the business of doing what? What's the goal, right? Are they in the business of making sure that they pay out for your medical expenses? Are they in the business of, essentially taking your money and providing the least amount of services possible, right? Specialization of doctors. This is another issue too, and it creates other problems too. So doctors specialize. Why are so many doctors specializing? Anybody here want to go to med school? Anybody here familiar with this? Maybe, right? There's a shortage of primary care physicians right now. And the reason why there's a shortage, some people will argue, of primary care physicians, because individuals who are going to go to med school, once, think about how much it costs to go to med school, right? So if you're going to go to med school and you're looking to essentially be in a dent well over 100 grand by the time you get out, if not more, right? Do you want to be a primary care physician, or do you want to specialize? Where are you going to make more money, as a primary care physician, or if you specialize? And the idea is that through specialization is where you make money. So primary care physicians don't make as much. Now there's a shortage of primary care physicians, right? And that's a problem, because primary care physicians are the ones that are going to essentially determine if there's something going on, right? They're going to be the ones who provide that preventative medical care for you, right? So that's a problem. Specialized doctors, price goes up. More high technology, right? It's essentially high-tech technology, right? That's kind of weird. My apologies. So the idea is that technology, essentially it is that as technology increases, so does the price, right? Somebody's going to have to pay for that machine that you're using. Somebody's going to have to pay for the technicians running those machines, right? So the medical companies, they are not going to lose. Doctors are not going to lose, right? They're going to pass this on to who? The customer, us, right? We're going to have to pay for these things. Lack of preventative care. Once again, this goes to the whole specialization of doctors and the fact that they pay more, right? And then the aging population, which is something that we've talked about already, right? A lot more people are aging. This is going to be the largest population of elderly individuals that we've had, right, in our history. And it's going to be a difficult thing to contend with, right, as far as how we're going to be able to pay for this. And then more lawsuits, right? So people suing left and right. And once again, these companies they're not going to take that loss. They're not going to take that hit financially, right? So if a company gets sued, what do? Is they pass those losses down to us, right? So they're going to recoup their losses by doing what? Raising the cost of medical care, right, and procedures. And there's a lot of other things that go into this too, right? We haven't really even talked about medicine yet, or any of those things, right? We haven't talked about patents. For those of you familiar with the medical industry, you understand that patents are a very serious problem in terms of medical care, right? So what I mean by that is if I have a patent for a particular medicine. So if I'm a pharmaceutical company and I develop a new medicine and I have a patent for it, that patent I believe is good for like 20 years. Then after 20 years, right, then people can go ahead and make generic versions of that medicine, then it drives the cost down. But for that 20 years, I can drive the costs up. Essentially, I have the patent, so I can essentially charge whatever I want for that medication. Once the 20 years are up, and then the price comes down almost like by 80-90%. But what a lot of companies do is they continue to add different patents, they change things, tweak things, so they can continue to add patents onto that medication, so they can keep a monopoly on that medication, right? So the idea is that maybe competition isn't healthy. Maybe competition isn't actually, or free market isn't great in terms of providing healthcare, right? Because at this point, my goal isn't to provide healthcare. My goal is to make sure that I keep a patent for a medication or keep for a procedure or some type of machine or something like that, right? I don't want anybody else to use it. So the idea is it's not driving innovation in that sense. It's not driving or the spirit of like competition, right? Or we competing to come up with the best product. No, now essentially what I'm doing is making sure that I can keep control and monopolize whatever it is that I can develop, right? So maybe that's the issue, right? Why things are becoming so expensive, because now it's about controlling and not innovating, right? So private insurance programs. So that's going to be, well, maybe not most of us, but a lot of us, right? So most employers require the employees pay a share of the insurance premium. So if you've worked at a company that provides insurance, you're paying into it. Insurance companies rarely cover the entire bill. So the idea is they're going to go ahead and pass something down onto you, right? It's going to be deductibles or co-pays or something like that, right? So deductibles have been steadily increasing the financial burden caused by a serious accident or illness. So 64% of the population is covered by traditional insurance, okay? 86% receive insurance through an employer, okay? And 14% buy their own. So 14% buying their own, those are individuals with lots of money. We could argue, right, for the most part, if they're receiving medical care, right? So the idea is that within the system, if you're lucky enough or fortunate enough to have an employer who provides medical, right, then this is what we're looking at in terms of insurance, right? But think about it. With the work, and we'll cover this in the next chapter, right? The way work is changing now. A lot of these traditional jobs, where you go into full-time, right, to provide insurance, those are disappearing. So a lot of work now is done contingent workers, part-time, contract, whatever term you want to use, right? So essentially these are kind of precarious workers. And a lot of these companies are not providing this, right? So a lot of companies that provide full-time or that provide healthcare for full-time workers. Well, a solution for them would be just not to offer full-time work. Let's go ahead and offer part-time so we don't have to pay for overtime. We don't have to pay for sick time, vacation, and we don't have to provide insurance. We'll hire just part-time employees, right? And it'll be cheaper to do that than it is to hire one full-timer when we have to pay for insurance and things like that. So that's kind of what we're seeing, right? Companies finding a way to not be responsible for providing medical care to their employees. Who pays? Well, we kind of already been talking about this, right? Most people rely on healthcare insurance. So there's a few different types, right? But the main types would be HMOs and PPOs, right? So the first would be HMOs, health maintenance organization. So private insurance organizations that provide medical care to subscribers for a fixed fee, right? Require patients to choose medical care providers from a list of participating professionals and forces customers to use doctor that they do not know. For the most part, right? Some places, some are better than others, right? But this is the idea, right? We're going to go ahead and control this entire healthcare experience, right? From beginning to end, right? So if you're an HMO, like say maybe like Kaiser, right, would be a good example of this, as far as like an HMO, right? So if you're with Kaiser, then like the doctors are Kaiser, everything's Kaiser, right? And if you guys have ever had to go to a doctor, like you may be in an emergency room, right? You try to find a hospital that works with your insurance, right? And then if you go to the doctor or the hospital that does work with your insurance, and you keep your fingers crossed that the doctor that's working there is covered with your network, right? And maybe the doctor's out of network. So if you've ever experienced this kind of frustration and headache, then you know how how daunting this experience can be, right? For people, that are going to the emergency room or even urgent care, right? I mean, you can go into an emergency room and the doctor is out of network. So now you're getting a huge bill, right? It's kind of the idea. Anyways, so in summary, the idea of what the HMO rise is to control the cost through managed care by controlling the treatment process, right? And this is another issue or another headache that people run into, right? Is what will they cover? So if you're going in and let's say you're having headaches, right? And let's say you're going in because you think you may have a brain tumor, right? We'll just go ahead and use that. So, you think you might have a brain tumor, you convince your primary care physician that might be the issue. They might be, concerned with maybe a tumor and they want to double check, right? So they're going to go and send you in to get a scan, right? So they're going to check this part, right? But maybe, there's an issue with your neck. Maybe there's an issue maybe further down here. Who knows, right? It's causing a headache, right? You're getting really bad headaches. It could be any number of things, right? It could be herniated disc, it could be pinching a nerve, it could be anything. But you only went in for the head, right? So they're only going to image your head, not your neck or not the shoulder or not anything else, right? You figured, well, you're already here. It's right there. Let's just go and get all of it imaged, right? So we can see and take a look. But the idea is they're not going to pay for that, right? They're going to look and say, well, your doctor thinks it might be a tumor. And this one little location, we're only going to essentially cover that. Anything else, we refuse. So if you've ever had medical, like if you ever gone to a primary care physician and then requested or had your primary request testing and things like that, and then to have the insurance company tell you no because they argue that it's not required, right? To have somebody say, well, we don't want to spend the money for this, so we're going to say that it's not required or not important, right? Or you're going to have to show us that there's a reason for you to have this kind of testing done or this kind of treatment done, right? So essentially the idea is that you're fighting with them to provide you the service that essentially you're kind of already paying, that you have been paying for, right? So that's the frustration, right? So government insurance programs. I told you we'd talk about this, right? Medi-Cal or Medicaid, or Medicare or Medicaid, excuse me. So Medicare, part of Social Security for those that are 65 and older, right? So those of you who have family, relatives, parents, maybe grandparents that are 65 plus, this is them, right? This is essentially what we've been working for. Right now I'm paying into this. And if you're working right now, you're paying into this so that when you hit 65, you'll be able to take this, right, as part of your Social Security. This is a safety net, right, for individuals who, well, in our population who get to that age. They retire and they can have access to healthcare, right? So this is what the concern is. Will there be enough resources to keep this going? And that's all this idea too, that the number keeps moving. And I know that there's been talks politically, right, recently of reevaluating the age for Social Security, reevaluating a lot of these kind of social safety nets, right, that we have in place. And other countries as well. I mean, right now, France, if you guys, I think I might have mentioned it already, but like France, President Macron wants to, and not just Macron, right, other people within the French government, but Macron, the president, wants to increase the age of retirement by 2 years. So I think the age of retirement, I could be wrong, but I think the age of retirement is like 62 in France, and they want to raise it to like 64 or something, right? So 2 more years is what they want to push it back to. And the French people are losing their minds, like just rioting in the streets, burning stuff in the cars. And if you go look at French protests, for like Social Security retirement, you'll see tons of videos of French people protesting. You're talking hundreds and thousands of people just out in the street, just protesting. It's actually kind of impressive, right? So that's the idea, right? That this is kind of a part of a contract, right, that we have as citizens and the government, right? I'm a good citizen. I work. I'm law-abiding. I pay into the system. I pay my taxes. And then when I'm 65, 65 years old, I want what? I want this to be here waiting for me, right? I want to be able to know that I can retire and Social Security will be available to me because I paid into it. I rely on it. And right now, a lot of people are concerned. They're concerned that Social Security won't be there for them. And that's scary. And then we have Medicaid, right? So there's poor people with special needs and families with dependent children, right? Special needs, depending, it can include individuals that are blind, permanently disabled, pregnant, those who have aged, who live in families with dependent children. Right? There's any number of things that can, qualify for this, right? And this is a social safety net, right? We're going to go ahead and provide these services to individuals because, well, the idea is that we can measure essentially the success, right, of our country and our government by, how we treat the individuals that are in need, right? I mean, think about it. Special needs. I mean, you might, if you're not special needs yourself right now, remember, those things can change. What if you're in a horrible car accident, right? Something happens to you, and now you go from an able-bodied individual to somebody who is disabled, right? What happens to you? Times are going to be tough. You might find yourself homeless, right? There has to be government intervention, right? There has to be some part of our government that provides something, right? Just in case things go south, right? And that's kind of what this idea is, right? So we pay into it, and hopefully we never have to use it ourselves, right? Hopefully we remain healthy, and that's never an issue that we have to deal with. If you know anybody who is disabled, then you understand exactly what I'm talking about. 16% of the population enrolled in Medicaid. That's quite a lot of people, right? But don't worry, there's money for it. We have plenty of money. Now, do we want to spend it on that? That's another thing, right? But there's plenty of money to cover that. All right. And speaking of coverage, right? The coverage problem. So the coverage problem is essentially 33 million people, and about 10% of the US population have no medical coverage at all. This is a problem, right? This goes back to this whole idea of maintaining physical health, mental health, and then, like I said, overall social well-being, right? With 10% of the population not covered, how does that translate into other social problems or social issues? I mean, think about it. That many people without medical, like, eventually our bodies break down. That's just inevitable. Hopefully it's later rather than sooner, but the idea is that eventually we're all going to need medical care. Okay. And as older we get, the more care we're going to need. So think about what happens to the population that doesn't have access to this. What happens to them? Do they just die? Right? They have some medical condition that could have been treated, or they age and they suffer, right? That they end up living, their golden years, right? Will be, in misery. Like, that's not. We could do better than that. It is kind of the idea, right? Should we be doing better than that? Maybe that's another question, right? This is a social class, from a functionalist perspective, right? Should we be doing better than that? Or is this kind of the natural progression of things, right? For those who can, save money and work hard and make sure that they have a 401k and all those things, so that by the time they retire, they have those, a financial safety and an egg nest, right, that they can fall back on. What about the people that can't? Are they just not deserving of even basic medical coverage? It doesn't seem like too much to ask, right? Medical insurance does not cover all the costs of serious accident or illnesses. Like I said, once again, things can happen to us. It might not be a medical issue in terms of, just us aging or something that happens with our bodies, right? Diabetic or things like that, right? But what if it was just a car accident, right? Something that out of your control. Not to say the medical issues like that too are out of your control, like you have some kind of like genetic disease or something like that, right? But like a car accident, that's out of your control. You're just going about your business and somebody rear ends you, and then you're injured, you're hurt, or they T-bone you or something like that, and then now you're disabled. Do you want the government at that point to help you? Right? Think about it. Or would you still be willing to say, well, it's my personal responsibility, right? And if I can't provide medical care for myself, then I just don't deserve it. Right? It's easy to say that it's a personal responsibility when you're not personally affected by it. And then we have Obamacare, right? Or universal health care. So all families now pay insurance tax, right? So First thing, insurance companies can no longer drop existing customers because they get sick. This is a big one, right? So the idea is that an insurance company, if somebody gets sick, they can drop you. So if you get sick with something that's going to cost them too much money, they're going to be like, whoa, hey, that's going to cost us way too much money. We'll drop you. Or even worse, right? Insurance companies, depending on your medical history, can deny you coverage. So if you're trying to get coverage somewhere and they look at your medical history and they see that you have some kind of underlying health condition, right? They'd be like, you know what? You have that thing. Well, I mean, what it is, right? Maybe you're, I don't know, MS or lupus or diabetic or, something along those lines, right? Something that, would be a serious illness, right? If you have something like that and you're trying to get coverage and like, oh, well, we see you have a history of this or that. We're not going to cover you because, well, this is just going to be too expensive and we're just not going to do that. So literally insurance companies can deny you access based on your previous medical history, or if you get sick and they just decide that just not financially feasible for them. Well, not feasible. It is feasible. They can do it, but financially in their best interest to continue to cover you, right? So you've been paying into an insurance company for years, you come down with an illness and they decide that, you know what, it's just not smart financially for us to continue to cover you, and they'll just drop you, right? Like, we should be doing better, right? And the idea with universal healthcare, Obamacare, is that we can do better, right? So like I said, insurance companies can no longer just drop you. They can deny you access for pre-existing medical conditions, right? Parents can include children up to the age 26 on insurance, which is something they weren't able to do before. So for some of you, this might be something that you actually still benefit from, right? For those of you that haven't hit the age of 26 yet, right? You could still definitely be claimed on your parents' insurance. Fantastic, right? Good for you. And if you are, then you should take advantage of that and go to the dentist, go get that preventative health care, right? Go see your doctor, your primary care physician. All families are required to have insurance. And this is where people have an issue with universal healthcare, Obamacare, right? This idea that people who do not have or buy insurance will be subject to penalties, right? So some people argue this is overstepping, right? This is too far, right? The idea that if you don't have medical coverage, you could be taxed, right? Or it'll come tax time, right? That you can be penalized for it, right? So for some of you might have experienced this, right? So for those of you who don't have medical care, right, and haven't found medical coverage, right? Essentially, the idea is what you can go. Essentially, what you do is you go and you apply for universal health care, right? Depending on how much money you make, will determine how much will you qualify for, right? So if you have no job, no work, nothing, you have no work, then you can qualify for was it going to be Medicare, right? I always get the two confused, right? So you qualify for that, right? So that you have no job, no money. This is what you qualify for. We'll provide this for you, but you do work. Okay, so you do make money. How much do you make? And how much you make? And you essentially, it's almost like a brokerage, right? You can find a healthcare plan that kind of fits your needs and essentially what you can afford, right? And that's what they're going to want to see. They're going to want to see that you have something, right? And if you don't show them you have something, you get taxed, right? So when you go and do your taxes and they ask you if you have medical coverage and you say no, that could definitely affect your income tax return, right? For those of you who have seen that, I have, right? And so some people argue this is the government overreaching, right? So it depends on how you want to view that. You could view it that way. You may not. All right. Class, ethnicity, and race, right? So not a shocker, right? Individuals who have access to resources, have access to, well, essentially better healthcare, better health coverage, right? It's unfortunately, right, not a hard concept to grasp, right? Poverty harms health. And I love this little article here, right? Flies in operating rooms cause Los Angeles Veterans Hospital to postpone dozens of surgeries. So imagine you go into a hospital, you're going to get a surgery. And when you go to get a surgery, and I understand that these things exist, right? Like I've seen these before, right? But if you look closely in the image, you see this here. You know what this is? This is a little bug zapper, right? So the idea is the little flies see the light and they fly to it and they get zapped and they fall into this little thing here, right? Sometimes they're blue. I guess this one's green. But the idea is there's so many flies in this hospital that they can't perform surgeries because there's a risk of those flies landing on you as you're being operated on and on equipment and things like that, right? So they have to postpone the surgeries. That's a problem. That is a problem. And the veterans, the VA hasn't been doing a particularly great job in recent history as far as providing health coverage, right, to veterans. And there's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down, but we won't. Right. But the idea is that individuals who lack resources, like essentially suffer from poor nutrition, unsafe environments, higher accident rates, essentially the idea that we talked about absolute poverty. So this right here is essentially just absolute poverty. Food, shelter, healthcare, education, those things, right? You lack those things, your life's in jeopardy. Okay. And then as far as race and health, obviously minorities are twice likely to go without prenatal care, race and bias in health, and life expectancy. So race and bias or racial bias in health would be the idea that within this institution, right, individuals who are minorities essentially suffer from inadequate or subpar medical care based on the fact that they're, a member of a minority group is essentially what it is, right? We can throw women in on that one too, right? There's been a lot of research lately about, I think the term would be, I got some of you probably already know what this is, just thanks to TikTok, medical gaslighting. So some of you might be familiar with this term, maybe, medical gaslighting. If you're not, this is what it is, right? Medical gaslighting is the idea that doctors will gaslight female, and it could be male too, but primarily female, right? We get a lot of women complaining about this, that they'll go in and say, I'm having really bad chest pains, I'm having really bad, pains in my lower abdomen, and I'm concerned, and the doctor's gonna be like, oh, it's anxiety, it's gas, it's your period, it's just something like that, not a big deal. Here, take some Tylenol, walk it off, and you'll be fine, right? And there's been quite a few stories, and you can argue that these are just kind of anecdotal, right? Maybe not significant because we're not using the scientific method, right? But we could use the scientific method or actually do research on this, right? About medical gaslighting and things like that. If you wanted to do research, there you go, right? If you want to do a master's or a PhD, there you go. Medical gaslighting would be a fantastic topic for this, right? But the idea is that, women go in and they complain about, the symptoms. I don't say complain, but they complain about having these symptoms and they're not being taken seriously, right? So there's been plenty of women that go in and say, I'm having, like I said, heart problems, and they're telling them it's anxiety and it's a blood clot, right? Or they're having some heart attack, or they're having, pains in their midsection, or lower abdomen, and they're saying it's, something related to something else. And it turns out that, it could be, like one of my friends, right? Not to get too much information, but one of my friends had this happen to her. She went in, lower abdominal pains, really bad. It's not a big deal. Go home, you'll be fine. It got worse. She called in. It's fine. It's probably that. And then it got so bad that she went in. She went to the emergency room. And in the emergency room, they found out that she had an ectopic pregnancy. And if you know what an ectopic pregnancy is, you understand how dangerous this is. And essentially what happened was, she was swelling up, and she's almost at the point where it was going to rupture. And if she would have ruptured, there's a good chance that she could have died. So she went to the emergency room. They figured out what it was. Thank God. And they're like, well, you need to go into emergency right now, or you're going to die. Even though she had talked to a doctor about it previously, and they told her it was not a big deal. So that's the idea of medical gaslighting. So as a minority, we can argue that women have like a minority status within society, right? Essentially because they lack power within society, right? So they're not taken seriously because they're women, right? Anxiety and things like that too. There's other issues as well. So here we go, right? Women have a higher life expectancy than men. Way in which culture defines masculinity. Let's see if I care about this. All right, so this idea that gender also works against women, right? So women do have a higher life expectancy than men. We can argue this because women, you could say, maybe take better care of themselves. They're less prone to taking risks, things like that. But also the issue too, right, that it works against them for the kind of things we just talked about, right? Lower standard or social standing affects healthcare for research. general stereotypes or start medical treatment. So this is the medical gaslighting part, and also the history too, right? In terms of so medically, women have kind of been second-class citizens in terms of priority, right? So a lot of medical research is done on men primarily or initially, and then with enough time, maybe women. But this is kind of the idea, right? That men or women are different biologically, and they do have different needs, right? Medically. And the priority was never to provide outstanding medical care for women. It was to provide outstanding medical care for men. So the idea is that women suffer for this or because of it, right? It is the idea. So their low social standing affects the research that's provided. So essentially companies aren't going to provide the research. I mean, you maybe think about it this way, right? It's going to sound horrible. Let's talk about birth control really quick, right? This is going on longer than I wanted it to. All right, so birth control. Tons of birth control for women, tons, right? And for women in the class, you understand that there are definitely side effects, very significant, life-threatening side effects associated with taking birth control, right? And so there's that, and then there's also just the uncomfortable part of it too, right? I have horror stories from my friends about their birth control stuff. Like one of my friends had the little IUD, the little insert that went in there. Essentially, it went in. It's a little surgical procedure to put it in there, and what happens is it shifted, and it like got caught in I think the uterine wall or the cervix. Essentially, it shifted and it started digging into her body internally. So she had to have a surgery to have it removed, right? So if you're familiar with birth control, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? But in terms of birth control for men, what are the options for men, right? It's vasectomy, condoms, and that's pretty much it, right? Do we have birth control for men? And the idea is, not the idea, but we do, right? Are you guys familiar with this? The male birth control pill, right? It's been around, it exists. Is it in the market yet? I don't think it is. Will it be? Probably not for a while. Why? Anybody know why? Maybe you guys can already answer that, right? It's not available because of the side effects. So essentially the side effects for men taking the birth control are like the same side effects for women. For women, we're like, that's fine. You guys can take it, and blood clots, strokes, all these other things. You can roll the dice on that, right? So we're okay with that. But when it comes to men who suffer the same or can suffer essentially the same side effects using birth control, we're like, oh no, we can't have that. There's too many side effects. We're not going to put that to market. That's a double standard for sure, right? So if you guys don't know about that, go take a look. It's out there. All right. Disability. We talked about people or we mentioned briefly disabilities, right? So disability is essentially a physical or mental condition that limits a person's everyday activities, right? So essentially it prohibits you from participating. And this is the issue, right? Is that it shouldn't, but it does, right? So it makes participation in everyday things difficult, right? And that's why we have, at least within our country, right, this push to, make things accessible to people, right? In terms of the classroom, in terms of, anywhere, like for me, for my lectures, right? If there's somebody in the classroom with a disability, then essentially what I would have to do is I'd have to figure out a way to make the content. So that essentially the course material that I provide to individuals who aren't disabled still has to be available to people that are disabled. So I've had students in my class who are, suffer from, hearing loss, right? I've had students that are blind. So, it's one of those things where I have to be aware of, what their disabilities are and then provide them with the same course material that everybody else gets, right? So, because it's only fair that, as a student that they get the same material, right? And this is the idea, right? Here in this country, we have that. We have laws, as a matter of fact, right, that make this mandatory, right? So if I was somebody who was disabled and I try to go into a business, right, and let's say I was in a wheelchair or something along the lines, right? And they didn't have a ramp, right? Legally, that business is supposed to provide a ramp. That business is supposed to provide or make accommodations for individuals who have disabilities. And in failure to do so, well, will result in some sort of fine and thing like something along those lines, right? So we do make a definite an attempt, an effort to do that, right? And mental disorders. The tough part with mental disorders is how do we see a mental disorder, right? So if I mean, so let's say if I'm physically disabled, right? So if I'm in a wheelchair or I'm blind, right? I have the chair, I have, some sort of maybe like a, I've had students have had a, a little stick, the little cane that they walk with, I've had students in class that I've had interpreters, or essentially just somebody who will do sign language in class, right? So we could see, right, that those individuals have a disability, right? But for somebody who has a mental health disorder, all right, I mean, is it more difficult to see? I'd argue that it is, right? And I'd argue a lot of people suffer from mental health disorders and don't even realize it, right? There's definitely a stigma attached to mental health disorders, right? People feel that, I mean, growing up, I knew this was an issue, within the culture that I grew up in, right? Like nobody went and talked to somebody, right? Going to seeing a therapist, going to seeing a psychiatrist, going to seeing a counselor. But these are things that you didn't do, right? So the culture I grew up in was Hispanic culture, right? Mexican culture. So the idea is that to do something like this would be seen as a weakness, right? Like, oh, you can't handle the stress. You have to go talk to somebody. Oh, then you're somehow weak because of it, right? So there's a stigma that is attached to seeking help for mental health disorders, right? Or something along these lines, right? So this is an issue, right? But the idea is that mental health disorders are very common. I argue that most people suffer from something, right? It could be, not say as simple as, because it's not simple, but stress, anxiety. These are all things that we feel, right? I'm stressed out. I have work, I have other responsibilities. I feel like there's never enough time in the week. I always feel like there's something pressing. I'm sure most of you are in the same boat. This is an online class, right? So I'm guessing that most of you here have other responsibilities. I know you do, right? You guys have a lot of, you guys have jobs, families that you're responsible for, right? Now you're taking my class, right? This is one more thing to add on to a really heavy load, right? You must feel it, right? You must feel that stress and strain, right? And if we don't have healthy outlets, right? If we don't feel like we can talk about these, the stress and the strain that we feel, right? And without, the fear of being ridiculed or stigmatized, I mean, I have friends that, let's say I have friends that have pursued careers with pretty extensive background checks, government, things like that, right? And for a lot of them, they refused to seek mental health services. Like that was part of their thing before they got hired, right? No drinking, no drugs, no criminal record, and no mental health services. And it was strange to me, right? I'm thinking, like, well, if you need to talk to somebody, go talk to somebody, right? There's no shame or stigma attached to that. But for the people that know that we're trying to get these jobs, like, well, yeah, there is. Because if you're going to go get one of these jobs with this kind of high clearance requirements, they'll ask you about your mental health history. Have you ever talked to somebody? Have you ever felt like you needed to talk to somebody, right? And this becomes a part of the interview process. Now, this becomes potentially a sticking point, right? If I'm trying to apply for a job, in the government, and then the government wants to know about my mental health in terms of like, have I talked to somebody? What did I talk to them about? Things like that, right? They want to know what you needed the help with, right? Like this could be a reason for them not to hire you. So think about it. Think how many people refuse or don't seek out mental health services because they're afraid of what other people are going to think or what other people may do, right? How your family is going to feel about it, how potential significant others may feel about it, right? potential employers or future employers, right? How they might feel about it, right? It could cost you a job depending on, how that person views, mental health, or people who seek mental health services, right? So definitely a stigma still, right? Even though we understand that, that there shouldn't be a stigma attached to this, and that this is should be part of everybody's overall health plan, right? But we don't, right? And then just kind of continue with this whole idea of mental illness, right? So the idea is mental illness a myth, right? And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, right? The idea that some people will just simply just deny that mental illness and mental disorders are a thing, right? So Thomas Siaz will argue that an illness is only real if it affects the body in a way that we can see, right? But I argue that we can see mental health illness, right? If somebody's suffering from depression, if somebody's suffering from a mental illness and like this, right? I'd argue you can see it, at least in my opinion, right? There's going to be, if you know the person, right? If you know somebody and they're suffering from something like this, I argue you can see the change in them, maybe not just a way to interact with you, but maybe even a physical change, right? Are they eating less? Are they eating more, right? Then we kind of talk about like maybe just kind of, eating disorders, things like that. Self-harm, are they cutting themselves? Are they burning themselves, right? Even just self-care, right? Like, if somebody stops taking care of themselves, right? They, whatever it is, we can argue as far as take care of yourself, right? They're not bathing like they used to, or they're not dressing the way that they used to, right? And they're just kind of a more unkept, disheveled state, right? Like we can see those changes in people, right? And those can be indicators of, mental illness or mental disorder, right? So you can obviously see these things, at least in my opinion, right? And then, Ferris and Dunham study 1939 linked poverty and mental illness, right? Cause and effect goes both ways. I'm not too concerned with that. This I'm concerned with. This I think is a big issue. And the issue with this is, like so this all connects, right? This is all related to one another. So deinstitutionalization, right? The idea that we're going to release people from hospitals into local communities. So what problem does this create? I think you guys already know, right? Homelessness, right? The homelessness crisis that we're having within this country right now, not just in California, not just in LA, not just San Francisco, but all over the country, right? I just read an article this morning. I think Phoenix has one of the largest homeless encampments. It was I forgot how much it was, how the number of people that were there, but I think it was like 1,000 people, something ridiculous. I could be off, right? It was one of the articles I was reading quickly because I was going through stuff. But the idea is that this is something we're seeing across the country, and not just here in the United States, but other countries as well, too. So homelessness is an issue. And it could be, like I said, it's multifaceted, right? There's a lot of different reasons why people are homeless. One of them would be just financially, right? Homeless. But then there's individuals who suffer from mental health illnesses or diseases that are homeless, right? So when you defund or remove these services, these individuals go back out into the street, and then we have the populations that we do, right, that suffer from mental health issues. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to cover for this chapter. If you have any questions, issues, or concerns, please go ahead and let me know. I hope everybody's doing well. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.